We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
In Paris, there's been a dramatic announcement on nuclear weapons. It comes from the leader of one of the most powerful countries in the world, the Soviet Union. The president, Mr. Gorbachev, is in the French capital on an official visit. Today, he said his country wants to stop what's called the arms race between America and Russia and pave the way for lasting peace. And he said he wants a halt to weapons in space. That's what the Americans call Star Wars. The Soviet Union wants to halve the number of long-range missiles which each country has at the moment. They're the nuclear weapons powerful enough to reach the other nation's territory. Medium-range missiles, those are the ones controlled by Russia and America, but placed in European countries, would be cut as well. At the moment, officials from the two mighty nations are meeting in Geneva to discuss the future of nuclear weapons, but Mr. Gorbachev's announcement in Paris came as a surprise. This morning, the president was laying a wreath at the Arc de Triomphe in memory of those who died in the Second World War. It's the first time that he's visited a European country since he became leader, and it's been closely watched by the world's press. It's been surrounded, too, by great show. In 6 weeks' time, Mr. Gorbachev is meeting President Reagan, and today's announcement will be the main talking point at that meeting. Well, so far, there's been no response from America, and today they went ahead as planned with their military experiments in space. The space shuttle Atlantis blasted off from Cape Canaveral less than an hour ago on a secret mission. Newsround space editor Reg Turnell has been watching the preparations.
It's the first flight of Atlantis, the fourth and probably the last space shuttle. Much lighter than the earlier shuttles, it has 10,000 fewer of those troublesome heat-shielding tiles. For this top-secret military flight, it's an all-military crew, and the 5 men include the second of the specially trained military flight engineers. Newsmen have been allowed to watch the flight preparations, but had to wait until T-minus 9 minutes before being given the actual liftoff time. But as usual, most details had leaked out. A pair of military communication satellites will be launched, specially protected to prevent the Russians listening to President Reagan's messages to ships and troops. They'll also be testing an infrared telescope, which can look down and track enemy aircraft and missiles. When it was tried out on a shuttle flight 3 years ago, the lens cap wouldn't come off. We won't be told what's happening during this flight unless there's an emergency. But the Russians and many others too will be monitoring exactly what's going on.
They must be banned, but Mr. Reagan has insisted his research program must continue. For all their reservations, though, the Americans are carefully studying the Soviet proposals and will respond to them at the talks in Geneva, which undoubtedly have a new impetus.
A few hours after Mr. Gorbachev's speech, the United States announced the successful test of another Star Wars device. A ground-based laser beam was used to track a rocket in space for the first time. And earlier today, the space shuttle blasted off from Florida carrying 2 military satellites which will relay presidential orders to America's nuclear strike force in the event of war.
We have main engine start.
America's second secret military shuttle lifted off on schedule, a flawless maiden launch for the Atlantis shuttle, carrying aloft more military satellite hardware for deployment in space. The timing, no embarrassment here. Despite Gorbachev in Paris urging an end to Star Wars work, Atlantis, separating over the Atlantic, is carrying an exceptionally toughened military satellite that will not only resist a Soviet nuclear attack in space, but will safeguard the capacity for Mr. Reagan and his presidential successors to coordinate their nuclear forces worldwide in the event of war with Russia. In Washington, Chief U.S. Arms Negotiator Max Kampelman has flown in from Geneva and is even now secluded in a fourth-floor room with senators working over the Gorbachev missile proposals and the American position to carry on with the Star Wars program. Mr. Reagan himself, in the wet, off to campaign on the domestic tax reform obsession that eternally keeps foreign policy off the front page here. Even though Gorbachev's French maneuvers are not the news here that they are there, Reagan, as his presidential plane moved amongst American Air Force jets, made it clear that the Star Wars program goes on, whatever Mr. Gorbachev may say.
I'm sure that that is upsetting to them, but we're not going to retreat from the research that could deliver to the world a defense against these nuclear weapons and finally bring us to the realization that we should eliminate the nuclear weapons entirely.
At the spent launch pad at Cape Canaveral, silence from the military shuttle. We shall not hear from Atlantis until she returns. The physical message to the Soviets, uncompromising. Star Wars research is not for bargaining. At the White House, though, there's a whiff of a worry that Mr. Gorbachev is stealing the great communicator's clothes. Jon Snow, News at 10, Washington.
Here, unemployment jumped up by 100,000 today on one calculation.
Well, what do we do if the Soviets reject our position? We have to make this concession. There was a few seconds of silence, and then Admiral Moore spoke up and said, "We just go home."
The administration, reserved and dubious about the Soviet offer, is to deliver a kind of a counterblast in a briefing tomorrow about the development of Soviet Star Wars technology. This while the Americans press full ahead with their own.
A new orbiter joins the shuttle fleet and it has cleared the tower.
The shuttle Atlantis was launched today from Cape Canaveral on a secret Defense Department mission. One of its functions believed to be the testing of a Star Wars laser weapon. The Americans are moving ahead with research that they say they will not bargain away.
Now on Children's BBC, it is time for News Round.
Ling Ling, the giant panda. Is she going to have a baby? Hello again. Experts at an American zoo are anxiously waiting to see if their giant pandas, Ling Ling and Xing Xing, are about to become parents. The panda is one of the world's most endangered animals, and it's very rare for them to have babies successfully in captivity. But Washington Zoo says all the signs are that Ling Ling is pregnant. Pandas live in the wild in China, but their numbers are dropping alarmingly because of a food shortage, and the government is desperately trying to save them. And zoos are doing their part to increase panda numbers. 3 years ago in Spain's Madrid Zoo, a baby was born. He's doing very well. This year, in Tokyo and Mexico City zoos, 3 more cubs were born. Washington Zoo's Ling Ling has had 2 babies before. Sadly, both died. But experts say they're almost certain that she is about to be a mother again. To make sure all goes well this time, special medical tests are being carried out on Ling Ling. And to give her plenty of rest, her enclosure has been closed to the public. It's very hard to tell if a panda is pregnant, so a 24-hour TV watch is being kept on her. If she does produce a healthy baby, it'll only be the 11th born in captivity outside China. And everyone hopes that it'll be an important step towards saving a rare and very beautiful animal from disappearing altogether. The Golden Hind sailing ship has run aground. The replica of Sir Francis Drake's flagship was leaving Bristol on a journey south to Tenerife, but got stuck in the mud within 4 miles. The ship's an exact copy of the vessel which Drake used on his round-the-world expedition more than 400 years ago. She'd just spent a month in Bristol preparing for her voyage. She was on her way south as a tourist attraction when she hit a mud bank. A tug tried to pull her off, but failed. The thick mud has kept her upright, and it's hoped that the Golden Hind will be afloat again when the tide comes in this evening. The American Space Shuttle Challenger blasted off from Cape Canaveral in Florida just 5 minutes ago. And we've just got pictures of the launch. Newsround space editor Reg Turnell has been watching all the preparations.
3, 2, 1. We have ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of Challenger and the spacecraft.
And once again, hurricanes and rainstorms failed to stop the launch. On board Challenger are 7 men and 1 woman, the largest crew ever to fly in one spacecraft. On this mission, Challenger is acting as a sort of space taxi. West Germany has hired it for a week, paying NASA nearly £50 million. The crew of 8 includes 3 European scientists, 2 Germans and 1 from Holland. And one of their most important experiments will be with the Space Sled, British-made by a Cambridge firm. The astronauts will be whizzed up and down a 30-metre track to see if it makes them sick. The astronaut's helmet has a camera to measure effects on the eyes, and the results will be studied by the RAF at Farnborough. Sleeping problems will be tackled too. Anna Fisher looks happy here, since there's no upside down in space. But astronauts often feel very disoriented when they wake up. And Sally Ride reported that astronauts often dream they're falling. So this time they'll try sleeping in an inflatable tube, blown up to make it feel like sleeping in your own bed.
After dark launch, and the rocket made a brilliant sight.
T-minus 15 seconds. T-minus 10.
The 7-member crew was made up of 1 woman and 6 men, one of them the first Mexican in space. The shuttlecraft smoothly took up her orbit just over 200 miles high. The crew's tasks will include launching 3 satellites, practicing ways of building space stations, and observing if there are ways of taking water to the drier parts of Africa.
Roger, roll, Atlantis.
That's it. I'll be back with the 8:30 summary. Now, Frank.
Thank you very much indeed.
The astronauts on board the American space shuttle Atlantis are sleeping now after the first day of their latest mission. They successfully launched a communications satellite, and Newsround space editor Reg Turnell has been watching the day's events.
3, 2, 1, 0, and liftoff.
NASA made this a night launch to help Mexico, since one of 3 TV satellites on board was for them. Mexico won't be able to use this new satellite, deployed this morning, for 2 years, because the recent earthquake destroyed their Earth stations. So Morelos, as it's called, was sent out in such a way that it'll take 2 years to drift into the right position, and by then the ground stations will have been repaired. Once the satellites are launched, there'll be 2 long spacewalks, rehearsals for building the big station due to be started in 6 years' time. A 30-metre high solar wing for making electricity was successfully tried out 2 years ago. This time, 2 astronauts will practice assembling the girders needed to hold the station together. They've been practicing in underwater tanks for more than 10 years. And this mission will also be helping drought-stricken North Africa. This space picture of Lake Chad was taken 20 years ago and can be compared with this more recent Space Shuttle picture to show how Lake Chad has steadily dried up. This time astronauts will take pictures to try to find new sources of underground water in Africa.
Tonight, Halley's Comet comes closest to Earth on its way round the Sun. It passes Earth only every 76 years, but this time it's very difficult to see. To help some people spot the comet, 2 3-mile-long laser beams are being aimed at it from tall buildings in London tonight. And in Sydney, Australia, there are plans to switch off streetlights on the famous Harbour Bridge so that people can get a better view. But for anyone who misses it, there'll be more chances to see the comet over the next few months.
Space builders.
Two crew members, Sherwood Spring and Jerry Ross, astonished Mission Control with how fast they assembled and took apart large metal structures in zero gravity. They built an aluminium pyramid and a 45-foot high tower in far less time than the flight plan had allowed.
Okay, we're getting good downlink TV at this time, and those guys out there look great.
NASA said it would pass on the information to scientists planning a permanently manned space station.
Go ahead, Jerry.
And that's the news so far this evening. We're back at 9:15.
Career in space. They became floating construction workers outside the space shuttle Atlantis.
Working from the bottom of the shuttle's cargo hold, the task for Jerry Ross and Sherwood Spring was to put together a 40-foot tower and a pyramid using aluminium pieces which snap together much like a child's construction kit. The theory is that practice makes perfect, and the Americans are looking ahead to the 1990s, when they plan a manned space station orbiting the Earth. First of all, they've got to test the feasibility of building in space, and this time, all seem to be going well.
Okay, we're getting good downlink TV at this time, and those guys out there look great.
Feel great.
Even a drop spanner presents no problems in space. It just floats about until you get hold of it again. The space walkabout was scheduled to last 6 hours, but the two men proved such efficient zero-gravity builders that they finished 30 minutes early.
On the first building site in space. They've already assembled a metal pyramid. Mission Control were delighted. They say it's a big step on the way to a permanent space station.
It was hard to imagine that the construction workers were 220 miles up in space. They looked more like Spider-Man on a nighttime building site. Their task was to construct a tubular pyramid and then take it down again inside 30 minutes. They did it in under 20 minutes. And what's more, they did it 8 times, twice more than planned.
Okay, we're getting good downlink TV at this time, and those guys out there look great.
Feel great. This is working out pretty slick, though, Jerry. This is pretty good.
Tracking every moment of the shuttle's progress, NASA officials were astonished at the ease and the speed at which the men worked. Sherwood Spring and Jerry Ross, who'd practiced their building techniques in a giant water tank, also assembled a 45-foot high tower. That took 56 minutes, 49 minutes faster than scheduled. Sure proof that human beings could build a space station in the 1990s if they chose to do so.
And that's all from us this evening. Good night.
For the second day, they practiced assembly techniques to be used in the building of a future space station. Their work was praised as a striking success, and it showed Mission Control that big structures can be built relatively easily by the astronaut teams.
At building, they've been putting together a huge structure outside the shuttle as practice for building a permanent space station which NASA hopes will be ready by 1992. The crew are now preparing for their return to Earth tomorrow after a very successful mission. Newsround space editor Reg Turnell has been watching the astronauts at work.
Much of the time, the astronauts worked on the end of the robot arm, 15 meters above the payload bay. And after 12 hours working as space riggers, Sherwood Spring and Jerry Ross decided that building a space station should be quite easy. The foot restraint kept them in exactly the right position for work, and almost no tools were needed for their ready-made assembly kit. They had time to practice being electricians too, threading cables through the lattice work of girders. All their work was recorded on video cameras to work out later exactly how long it will take to build the space station, as well as for training space riggers to do it. Their only complaint was that clipping and unclipping 3-meter struts into a 14-meter high tower does make the hands ache. But once done, they demonstrated that one man can easily maneuver the whole thing into exactly the right position. Just how much of this sort of work will be needed can be seen from the tangle of girder work shown in these pictures of what a space station will be like. The girders are needed for joining together living quarters and solar panels and providing docking ports for the space shuttle. This flight has gone so well with no problems to sort out that Columbia is already on the launch pad preparing for the next flight in a fortnight's time. It should land back at the Cape 2 days before Christmas, instead of on Christmas Day. And for once, 5,000 space workers should enjoy Christmas at home.
The Voyager 2 spacecraft was launched on an incredible journey. It was sent out to explore all of the outer planets in our solar system. You probably remember the stunning pictures it sent back in 1981 from the giant planet Saturn. Now, after 5 more years hurtling through space, it's coming up on its next target, the planet Uranus.
Uranus was discovered in 1781 by an amateur astronomer, William Herschel, using a homemade telescope like this one. It's nearly 3,000 million miles away. Not surprising that the view of the planet from Earth isn't particularly impressive. Although its 5 moons were soon spotted, it wasn't until 1977, the same year that Voyager was launched, that it was discovered Uranus had a ring system like Saturn. But what makes Uranus unique is that the whole planet has been tilted through 98 degrees, possibly after being smashed into by a huge meteorite. And when Voyager reaches the Uranian system on the 24th of January next year, it'll shoot past at 78,000 kilometers per hour. In just 6 hours, astronomers will learn more about the planet than has been learned in the last 200 years.
Amazingly, NASA scientists have managed to repair and update Voyager 2, so now it's in better shape than it was when it left Saturn. They've pulled off some major long-distance surgery, particularly in this area. It's called the scan platform, and it's where the cameras are mounted. The whole platform got jammed during the Saturn encounter, and eventually the problem was traced to this, the drive gearbox. The gears were jammed, and they resisted all attempts to free them by rocking. But looking at a spare gearbox they'd got on Earth, they discovered what had happened. When it was working at high speed, the box wasn't being properly lubricated, so the gears had been grinding against each other, making a lot of this metal swarf, which had jammed up the gears. Now, to repair this, the NASA scientists used the spacecraft's nuclear power pack to alternately heat up and cool the gearbox, which made the metal expand and contract, squashing the swarf into the gear cogs here, into the teeth, allowing the shafts to turn again. And the scan platform is now working.
And that's not the only maintenance there's been. Because Voyager 2 is so far away, it's becoming very hard to separate its transmissions from the background noise of space. To ensure accuracy, the data has to be sent far more slowly, in fact, at half the speed it was sent from Saturn. To overcome this, the old 1977 computers, which send pictures back to Earth in the form of thousands of tiny dots per picture, have been completely reprogrammed using the latest 1985 software. The new method is so efficient that under certain conditions, Voyager will be able to send back pictures as fast as it did 5 years ago from Saturn. On Tuesday, NASA released the latest pictures of Uranus from Voyager 2. Even though the spacecraft is still millions of kilometers from Uranus, they're already the best photographs ever taken of the planet. Because radio messages to Voyager takes 2 3/4 hours each way, when it reaches Uranus, there'll be no chance for NASA scientists to make any corrections during the 6-hour flypast. Voyager 2 will be out on its own. Until the same time next week, good night.
Disney comes to Europe with a huge new theme park. Hello again. The Disney organization has finally announced that it is to build its long-awaited European theme park in France. Nearly 200 different places were carefully considered before the choice was made. The new park won't be ready to open for another 5 years, but it'll almost certainly become Europe's biggest tourist attraction. There are 3 other Disney parks in California, Florida and Japan. The new park, which is just outside Paris at Marne-la-Vallée, was chosen because it should be easy to get to from the rest of Europe. Roger Finn has been to Florida to find out about Disney's plans.
This is the biggest Disney park, and many of the rides planned for the French one will be the same as here. The decision to go to France will mean disappointment for Spain. It also wanted to build a European Disney World because it's sure to bring in lots of money and provide thousands of jobs. Ever since the Disney organization said that they were going to build a park just like this one in Europe, people have been trying to guess where it would be. Several countries have competed against each other to try and persuade Disney that they'd make the best European home for Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, and all the other cartoons from the Magic Kingdom. As well as a Magic Kingdom of its own, the new Disneyland will have hotels, camping grounds, restaurants and sports facilities. And there are also plans to build a second theme park based on Disney World's Epcot alongside. It will have imaginative demonstrations of what life might be like in the future. The Disney World in Florida attracts over 20 million visitors every year. It's expected about the same number will visit the French Disney World once it opens at the end of 1990. That would make it Europe's biggest tourist attraction. For millions of children in Britain and the rest of Europe who can't afford to travel to America to visit Disneyland, the holiday of a lifetime will soon be on their doorstep. This is Roger Finn reporting for Newsround in Disney World, Florida.
And there'll be a special report from Roger about the new Disney park in the new series of Newsround Extra next month. The launch of the American Space Shuttle Columbia had to be called off earlier today when the computer at Cape Canaveral suddenly shut down just 14 seconds before liftoff. One of the engines wasn't working properly and now it must be repaired. Newsround Space Editor Reg Turnhill has the details.
First, a long wait for the early morning clouds to break. If the shuttle blasts through rain, Columbia's heat-shielding tiles could be ripped to pieces. Then Russia's Salyut space station passed overhead, and no one wanted Columbia to collide with that. Finally, an hour late, the countdown reached T-minus 14 seconds.
We have a cutoff. We have a cutoff at T-minus 14 seconds. Ground launch sequence of spacing is in progress.
And NASA has just decided to postpone the launch till after Christmas to give their engineers a chance to change the faulty engine. A disappointing end to what's really been a marvellous year for America's astronauts. There were a few hiccups at the beginning. In April, a fly swatter device, specially made to switch on a 7-ton satellite that wouldn't start, was a failure. But several science missions were a great success. And later that month, monkeys and rats went along in preparation for the time when animals will be needed in space. And it all came right in August. A second attempt to repair the stranded satellite was a complete success. They sent it spinning off to the right position, and it's now working perfectly for the US Navy. The last mission was best of all. 2 spacewalking astronauts proved to all the doubters that they'll have no difficulty building the huge space station now being prepared for use in the 1990s.
Well, watching those pictures there, you can see that heavy snow has been falling in much of Britain today, with many roads closed because of blizzards. Ponds and canals have frozen, but the water authorities are warning people not to skate on the ice as it's likely to break. The snow has blocked roads around Ulster in the north of England and in Northamptonshire in the Midlands. The worst hit areas are around the Brecons and Black Mountains in Wales, where many schools closed early. Jerry Monty reports.
Wales caught the worst of the winter weather, thick snow bringing an early crop of vehicle accidents in mid-Wales. A jackknife lorry reducing the main road to a single lane between Swansea and Brecon. As the heavy fall continued, high winds brought drifting on high ground and closure to many by-roads. Livestock were soon in difficulties, especially sheep flocks, and with many ewes due to lamb shortly, farmers were quickly out taking food supplies to the animals. Gritting lorries and snow ploughs spread hundreds of tons of salt to keep routes open to isolated villages. At one stage, Powys County Council had over 200 vehicles working flat out. Children were sent home when school bus services became unreliable, and many of their parents also finished work early in mid-Wales as remote villages became cut off.
And bad weather at Cape Canaveral in Florida has meant that the launch of the American Space Shuttle Columbia has had to be postponed yet again. This is the mission's 4th delay, and now the launch won't go ahead until Thursday at least. Newsround Space Editor Reg Turnhill has the details.
This time there was nothing wrong with Columbia. It was rain clouds, not only over the launch pad, but over the runways needed for emergency landings. The 6-man crew, together with a politician passenger, went aboard for the 3rd time today to spend 4 more hours waiting in vain for liftoff. Strapped on your back, feet in the air, is pretty uncomfortable up there in Columbia's nose. What makes it worse for NASA is that work on the second launch pad in the foreground here is also being held up. So every day Columbia's launch is postponed means another delay for Challenger, due for launch from the second pad at the end of the month. The prospects for a shuttle launch every 3 weeks in 1986 seem doomed already.
Disappointment for America's astronauts as Columbia's launch is delayed again. Hello again. The launch of the American space shuttle Columbia had to be called off earlier this afternoon, just 31 seconds before blastoff. It's the third time this mission has been delayed, and the problems are costing NASA millions of dollars. Now they're hoping to try again tomorrow, but it's a worrying start to what NASA hopes will be a busy year. Newsround space editor Reg Turnell has the details.
Columbia's launch was stopped because a fuel valve wouldn't close. It's 2 years since Columbia, the first of the 4 space shuttles, went into orbit, but she seems reluctant to start work again. This was to have been the 10th flight of 1985. Now it's supposed to be the first of 15 flights in 1986. It should be a very exciting year in space. This is the first of 3 shuttle flights intended to take pictures of Halley's Comet as it passes close to the Sun, part of the international Halley Watch, with 5 unmanned satellites zooming in on the comet. At the end of this month, Voyager 2, launched 8 years ago, at last reaches the planet Uranus, 2,500 million kilometers away. Close-up pictures of the rings and 5 moons are already being sent back. In May, the shuttle is due to launch spacecraft Galileo into an orbit around Jupiter. For 20 months, it will not only study the famous red spot, but many of Jupiter's 16 known moons as well. In August, the 15-ton Space Telescope will be launched. Astronomers hope that it will look so far back into space that they'll be able to work out how the universe began. And meanwhile, NASA has produced a new design for the space station, which they hope to launch in 6 years' time. But the news about that isn't so good. Europe and America are quarrelling about who does what, and America is cutting the budget. It looks like being delayed until the mid-1990s.
Astronauts will try again for liftoff on Sunday, giving engineers a day to make sure that repeated refueling hasn't caused any damage.
Has been launched from the Kennedy Space Center in Florida after nearly a month of frustrating delay and last-minute cancellations. The 7-man crew includes Congressman Bill Nelson, who normally keeps his feet on the ground overseeing the shuttle budget.
After 6 disappointments in under a month, Columbia finally made it with a textbook departure as dawn broke over the Kennedy Space Center. There'd been so many postponements due to bad weather and technical problems that the launch of a sister shuttle scheduled for later this month has been delayed as well. All this bringing NASA unwelcome publicity about the reliability of the shuttle program. But today, Columbia, under the control of Navy Commander Robert Gibson, is performing flawlessly. The main task being the deployment of a commercial communication satellite. Columbia and her crew of 7 are now orbiting 200 miles above the Earth, with a planned return to the Florida launch site for next Friday.
Finally took off today at the 8th attempt. The shuttle has been hit by a series of technical and weather problems and was delayed 7 times before today's successful launch.
This morning the signs were favourable, the weather perfect as the 6 crew members watched their access platform pulling away for the final time. Each lost takeoff costs NASA $300,000 in fuel. So once again, mission controllers held their breath as the launch director counted away the final seconds.
12 seconds. T-minus 10. Go for engine start. T-minus 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. We have ignition. We have liftoff. Liftoff of Columbia and mission 61.
This successful launch was one of the most spectacular. The spacecraft climbing into the dawn sky at 5,000 feet a second, leaving a trailing stream of white-hot flame behind.
Roger, roll, Columbia.
Later this month, we should see the first teacher in space, and in the summer, Britain's Nigel Wood is scheduled to become our first astronaut. This morning, the pictures were so clear that you could see the spacecraft separating from its giant rocket. After its troubled start, Columbia was on its way, a 5-day journey in space ahead. Ken Rees, ITN, Washington.
And that's the news this Sunday evening. From all of us here, good night.
Have wasted no time in getting down to work. Their craft was finally launched at dawn yesterday after a record 6 postponements. The 7 astronauts, with a congressman among them, will be carrying out a series of scientific experiments during the week-long flight. They'll also keep a close watch on Halley's Comet. Within a few hours of liftoff, the crew accomplished the main purpose of their mission. They sent into orbit a powerful communication satellite which will improve television reception for American viewers.
7 previous countdowns were halted due to technical hitches or bad weather. This time it all went perfectly, with a spectacular launch into the dawn sky. During their 5-day mission, Columbia's crew are to photograph Halley's Comet and put a communication satellite into orbit. That's the news from
Comet from space and invaluable to scientists back on Earth. But they found vital light-intensifying equipment wouldn't work. When they came to switch it on, it was found someone else had already done so, and the battery was flat. Another problem is that a lid seems to be stuck open on an experiment in a cargo bay. Mission Control are now debating whether Columbia should return to Earth on Thursday. That's a day early. That's it. I'll be back at 8:30 with a summary. Selina.
Thank you. Now,
the Space Shuttle Columbia hasn't been able to land at Cape Canaveral today as planned because of bad weather. Yesterday, the shuttle's crew was told that their mission was to be cut short and they'd be returning today. But there was a sudden change in Florida's weather. Newsround space editor Reg Turnell has the details.
Only 19 minutes before he was due to fire his retro rockets, Columbia's commander was told to stay in orbit for at least another day. Just as rain delayed Columbia's liftoff, so it's held up re-entry, for rain can damage the delicate tiles. And no one wants a repeat of the last landing at the Cape, when Discovery came to a stop with damaged brakes and burst tires. Columbia must be ready on time for her next flight in March, or she'll miss the chance to study Halley's Comet. Meanwhile, Challenger is due to be launched in only 8 days' time. The crew will then include the first teacher in space. Krista McAuliffe will turn Challenger into a classroom, giving live lessons on how to fly the shuttle and what it's like living in space.
In places, and were worst along the west coast, where power supplies have been cut off. On the Isle of Skye, 34 children had a lucky escape when their school bus was blown off the road. None of them were seriously hurt. And at the ski resort of Glen Shee, the start of the Paraplegic Games, winter sports for the handicapped, was called off because of the high winds. MPs have voted by an overwhelming majority to carry on making people who travel in the front seats of cars wear seat belts. The idea was first brought in for a trial period 3 years ago. Jill Fraser reports.
The idea is to cut down the number of injuries and deaths on the roads. The Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents say they're absolutely delighted by the decision. We must continue, quite literally, belting up. Because, according to the latest figures, the number of people who've died whilst travelling in the front seats of cars has fallen by 470, and the number of seriously injured by around 7,000 since the law was introduced. However, despite these figures, not everyone is happy. When the law was first brought in, there was a big debate about whether lives really would be saved and whether people should be free to choose. Since then, it's been claimed that drivers who wear seatbelts drive more carelessly and that, as a result, other road users might be at greater risk. Accidents involving cyclists and pedestrians have been particularly worrying. In the first 2 years of the trial, the number of pedestrians and cyclists killed or seriously injured rose by about 1,600. But it's difficult to prove that this is a direct result of seatbelt wearing. For the time being, the law only affects people travelling in the front seats, although from October this year, all new cars will have to be fitted with rear seatbelts as well, though as yet, no one will be forced to wear them.
The Space Shuttle Columbia may return to Earth a day early from its 5-day mission because there have been problems with some of its equipment. NASA officials will decide this evening whether Columbia should return on Thursday to make sure it's ready for its next mission in March. The crew were planning to take detailed pictures of Halley's Comet using a special camera, but as we reported on Newsround yesterday, the astronauts found the camera's batteries were flat. The crew told Mission Control that they weren't able to repair the special camera, but they'd taken some pictures using an ordinary one. If they come out, these photographs will be the first of Halley's Comet taken from space. But in the payload bay, one of the crew's scientific experiments might not work, as the lid of one of the containers has jammed open. Because this mission isn't going completely to plan, NASA may bring Columbia back early to make sure that all the planned 15 shuttle missions are launched this year. Meanwhile, Friday's launch of the European rocket, Ariane, has been postponed for the third time. Like the shuttle, it's had technical problems. It's now due to be launched in February.
The Concorde Formation Flying Team. 4 supersonic planes celebrate their birthday. Hello again. Concorde, the world's only supersonic passenger plane, has been celebrating the 10th anniversary of its first flight carrying fare-paying passengers. There were special birthday flights to New York and to Glasgow. And to mark the day, British Airways released amazing pictures of 4 Concordes taking part in a unique flying display. Roger Finn reports.
It was a first for Concorde. 4 of them gathered at Heathrow Airport last month and then taxied out onto the runway to take off one after another. When they reached the Bristol Channel, they flew into formation and cruised over the Cornwall coastline at 300 miles an hour. This is what they were celebrating, the anniversary of the very first commercial flights, which took off at exactly the same time 10 years ago. On the top, an Air France Concorde from Paris, and below, a British Airways one from London. The next few years were not happy ones for Concorde. There were strong protests that the plane was too noisy and that it cost too much. Plans for hundreds of Concordes flying all over the world had to be scrapped. But despite the problems, Concorde survived, and today's 10th birthday flight from London to New York celebrated her survival in style. Many of the passengers had flown on the very first flight 10 years ago, and they were treated to the very best food and wine. And for passengers taking the regular shuttle plane to Glasgow, there was a birthday surprise. The normal Boeing 757 was replaced by Concorde, all for the same price. Only 16 Concordes were ever built, so this formation represents a quarter of the whole fleet. After many years of losing money, they're now finally making a profit. And today, British Airways said they were confident the plane would still be flying into the next century.